So I feel like this is going to be a really, really good video. Like, I'm excited about it.
Hey everyone, so today I want to talk about why it took me so damn long to figure out that I'm trans and a lesbian.
Are you a man or a woman?
Either way, it's not good.
I do identify as a lesbian.
We don't know whether anybody choosing to self-identify as a woman is doing so in good faith or bad faith.
Her car had broken down. I'd better pull over and help her, he thought. But it wasn't Mrs. Boggins, was it? It was one of the gang with a wig on.
It may leave women exposed to men pretending to be women.
They're not women, but they're also identifying as women.
If I can say erect penis on this programme.
There was absolute uproar.
Or you think that they'll want to self-reassign because they want to perv on women.
I certainly don't think it should be made easier to self-declare your gender.
And I wasn't even sure whether I would have been hired if they had known that I was trans.
Stop throwing slurs at me, you piece of shit.
Well, that means that you could go in and change to a woman tomorrow. Well, yes, you actually could do that.
I'm a girl today.
I've been incarcerated for 30 years now. I prefer to be housed with my identity.
Should there be a debate about trans rights, or should self-ID just be taken as a given and the conversation end there?
No, that's it. End of. Self-ID should be made law.
We're here today to talk about self-ID, how it can be abused as a system of categorising people, and highlighting some of the safeguarding risks that it poses. But first, let's meet this guy. This is Sid. He's a sex pest. Let's call him Sex Pest Sid. Now, Sid isn't that nice of a person. In fact, he's pretty nasty. Despite his good looks, Sid is a horrible man. He's not concerned with anything except assaulting women. He hasn't ever had a proper relationship, and he smells like burnt tyres. He lives in a basement and watches naked women on his computer all day. What's important to note about Sid, though, is that he's entirely fictional. He's a made-up character and not based on anyone real at all. We made him up. That's how we know this. And because we made him up, we can decide what and how he thinks. And Sid thinks he's a man. He's not transgender in any way. He's never considered it. All he knows is that he has a small willy and he wants to show it to women. We haven't done a lot of character development on Sid because he doesn't deserve it. But he definitely is not trans. He doesn't suffer from any gender dysphoria at all. He doesn't think of himself as trans. He's just a wrong'un, a cartoon villain, a very bad man. He definitely isn't transgender. One day, Sid decides that he's tired of looking at the naked women pretending to be lesbians on his computer and wants to see some in person. Having been banned from the many local businesses in his area, he thinks it best to create an online dating profile. He signs up to an app promoting itself as being lesbian only, but obviously he can't just post his own picture as he'd be spotted straight away as a bloke. So Sid decides to use an app to change his gender in his photo. Looking more like a woman, he signs up to try and trick lesbians into accepting dates. Many lesbian users of the app complain about this, but have their account suspended by the app's creators for being transphobic, even though Sid is not trans. It should be noted that in the real world, many people don't even try as hard as Sid though. The dating app Her, for example, has many different profiles from people who may or may not be transgender. There's no real way to tell, as Graham Linehan proved when he set up his own parody profile to highlight this.
It took me what felt like a really long time to figure out I was a trans lesbian. I'm also non-binary.
I kind of flip-flopped between bi and lesbian like multiple times enough to where it confused people. For the most part, woman, lesbian, good.
Because I did have that I'm trans in my dating apps, and I did wonder if that drew some women away. Were there women that maybe didn't flirt with me, that didn't match with me purely because I was trans? I'm not getting the amount of matches as maybe a cis woman would purely because I'm trans.
I always used to say, I'm a lesbian trapped in a man's body.
If you're a lesbian and you're gatekeeping trans women that are lesbians,
That is transphobic as f***.
Sadly for Sid, there are no takers, so he decides to find another way to meet women. Sid thinks about all the places he might be able to see naked women in the flesh, without having to try hard at all. He heads down to his local shopping centre, wearing a dress. He thinks that the policies many stores have around transgender inclusion will confuse shop assistants into letting him use the women's changing facilities and bathrooms. Armed with his mobile phone and a couple of small spy cameras he bought online, Sid nips into a branch of a large clothing store. Let's call it Narcs and Fences. Sid, using the store's self-ID policy that states that anyone can use the changing room they feel most comfortable in, decides to pick up a nice blouse and walk straight into the women's changing area. He pokes his mobile phone under the store next to him. Sadly for Sid though, there's no one in there. But rather than be disappointed, he sets up his small spy camera to look at the room, and he leaves the changing facilities. He doesn't even put the blouse back on the rack, he just leaves it in the changing room, because as we keep reiterating, he's not a very nice man. Sid then goes to the bathrooms in the store, waltzing straight into the female toilets. This is despite him not thinking of himself as a woman or female, but rather just being a sex pest. He tries the same trick with his mobile phone, but again there's no one around, luckily for them. He sets up another small spy camera and leaves the store. He'll review the footage later, in his basement. A shop assistant sees him walking out of the bathrooms, but can't say or do anything because of the company policy. She tells her manager, but her manager gives her a written warning for being transphobic, even though Sid is not trans. In the real world, many stores have such policies, including the retail giant Marks and Spencer's. They've been at the centre of controversy lately due to this policy, which allows people to use the changing rooms of the gender with which they identify, with staff getting into trouble if they question it. They've also seen several of their stores targeted by men engaging in public sex acts, but in the gents' toilets. This isn't just inclusivity, this is Marks and Spencer's inclusivity. Another retail giant, Morrison's, also seemed to have toilet trouble. Not only did one member of their staff film himself in their toilets, sending it to a 13-year-old girl on Snapchat, but a 10-year-old girl was sexually assaulted by Katie Dolotowski, a trans-identified male, in their Kirkcaldy branch in 2019. Dolotowski was also charged with filming a 12-year-old girl on his smartphone, over the top of a toilet cubicle. As for spy cameras, there have been a huge number of incidents in which such cameras have been found in women's bathrooms and changing rooms. This is a worldwide phenomenon that seems to be growing. As video camera technology is getting more advanced, cameras are able to fit into smaller and smaller spaces. We'd recommend anyone who feels concerned about this to go out and buy a spy camera detector for peace of mind. You shouldn't have to, but it seems that this is such a big problem that it makes sense to purchase one, to search for cameras anytime you have to use a public bathroom.
All right, something you can't see with the naked eye could be keeping an eye on you in your most private moment.
Yeah, illegal hidden cameras we're talking about here. They're getting stealthier every day.
Montgomery County man is under arrest accused of putting a disguised camera inside the bathroom of a cheerleading studio. 21-year-old Christian Gill is being held without bail.
Detectives are investigating after hidden cameras were found in women's bathrooms at 3 locations in the Florida Keys. The miniature cameras were found inside coat hooks that look just like this one.
In New Jersey, where Paramus police arrested a handyman accused of placing a hidden camera in a customer's bathroom.
The demand for hidden cameras keeps private investigator Jody Stacy very busy.
Again, it's getting cheaper, smaller, and more effective.
Almost anything can hold a hidden camera these days, from a clock to a stuffed animal, even this travel mug. And finding the camera can be a challenge.
You press this button, hold it up to your eye, and you see that red beam? You're gonna put it toward the device, and I'm looking for a red dot. There it is.
문제가 얼마나 심각한지 좀 보여드릴게요. 여기 화면을 보시면 여기 스파이캠이라고 써져 있는 영상이 하나가 있는데요. 여기 클릭해서 들어가면 실제로 스파이 카메라로 찍힌 것 같은 사진이 보이고, 그리고 이런 사진 같은 경우는 아마 천장 쪽에 달려있는 스파이 카메라일 거예요. 근데 실제 뭐 이런 영상이 돌아다니고 또 밑에를 보면은 이거 관련된 영상, 스파이 카메라 영상도 추가 추가적으로 들어가서 확인을 할 수가 있어요. 거의 장르처럼 존재하죠.
Sid feels a bit disappointed with his attempt so far, but decides to soldier on in his attempt to see some naked women. He decides to join his local women's rugby team, using their transgender policy of inclusion to sign up for trials. Scared of looking transphobic if they reject him, even though he is not trans, the team immediately puts Sid in the squad. He plays against another team of women and easily beats them by using his superior upper body strength to muscle them off the ball. Hoping to catch his teammates in the showers at the end of the match, Sid strips off and starts to shower, staring at the entrance of the changing rooms the whole time. Sadly for Sid, the other players all decided to head straight home without changing. Sid is sad, so gets washed, sets up another couple of small spy cameras, and heads home. In the real world, there are many instances of males joining women-only teams, or entering into female-only competitions. The most famous recent example being Laurel Hubbard, of course, who we spoke about in our last video. Just like Sid, Hubbard hasn't surgically transitioned to be a woman. He doesn't need to in order to be able to compete in women's sports. We covered this in our last video, so go and check that one out for more examples. Sid, putting this latest disappointment behind him, heads to his local gym and swimming pool. He knows that their self-ID policy also allows him to walk straight into the women's changing rooms without question, and looks forward to getting a glimpse of the naked women that may be in there. Sadly for Sid, the gym and swimming pool is closed due to an outbreak of pretty nasty verrucas, so he argues with the reception staff for a while, accusing them of misgendering him, and walks off home. He did that because he wanted to make sure that he wouldn't be challenged again in the future. In the real world, there have been many instances of males entering female-only changing rooms and spaces in leisure centres, spas and swimming pools, the most infamous recent case being the We Spa incident in Los Angeles, which sparked protests and claims of a hoax, despite several female witnesses claiming to have seen a male naked in front of women and children inside the spa, and 5 women filing police reports alleging indecent exposure. There has been no confirmation at all that the naked man was transgender, or whether he was just using the self-ID loophole to gain access to female spaces. And anyone thinking that unisex spaces might be the answer to this issue might be surprised to learn that the majority of reported sexual assaults at public swimming pools in the UK take place in unisex changing rooms. The Independent reported in 2018 that 90% of complaints regarding changing room sexual assault, voyeurism and harassment related to incidents in unisex facilities, and a third of all sexual attacks at leisure centres took place in unisex changing rooms.
It's like every single day, you guys, and this is why I complain about all the time. Look, what's his name? What's your name? Alex? Yeah, your name's Alex, and I'm gonna be talking to your manager. This guy called me sir. This happens every day. Everywhere I go, I get called sir. I'm so tired. Why would you call a chick big ass This is transphobic harassment. You're a bigot at work. Alright, Alex, you know what? I can't wait to just... It's a slur. Do you not understand? It's like if you call the person of color the N-word. Don't You did on the way out. I don't care. I have the right to be pissed about it. You did. I said I'll lock the door. You did, you liar.
Mother, take it outside. If you want to call me sir again, I will show you a sir. Mother.
I want to move on right now, and I want to get to your prison story, because something that people probably don't know is the fact that you served time in prison.
Actually, a lot of people know that because there's a meme with my intake penitentiary mugshot on it going around, all shaved head and everything. And yeah, there's a meme with pretty much probably about half the mugshots I've had in the last 15 years.
We spa, so you don't. So it's okay. I just want to be clear with you. It's okay. It's okay for a man to go into the women's section, show his penis around the other women, young little girls underage. Your spa, we spa, condone that. Is that what you're saying? Like I asked. It's so he can stay there. He can stay there. What sexual orientation? I see a dick.
Not okay.
Okay, that's traumatizing to see that. I'm a woman. I think this is a place right here, I'm told, only for women. So So how dare you sit up here and tell me I don't have a right as a woman to defend? I'm telling you, he has a penis, a full and testicle, okay? And I don't care what it's a man. You got one? You're a man.
In Koreatown, police and protesters clashed in front of a spa. Opposing groups also attacked each other, but officers say there were no arrests.
Sid, now feeling very dejected, decides to up his game. He changes his name by deed poll in order to hide his past convictions from any criminal record database searches against him. It works. Sid signs up with his local Girl Guides troop as a troop leader. He knows that their self-ID policy allows him to join the girls on trips out and about, including overnight camping holidays. In fact, the Girl Guide group he joins are legally obligated to respect and acknowledge him as a woman, just because he says he is, even though Sid isn't trans. On the camping trip, Sid gets to share a tent alone with several young girls. He's the only adult in their group. The parents of these girls are not notified about this, because the Girl Guides isn't obligated to tell them under their new inclusion policies. Several of the female Girl Guide leaders aren't happy with the situation, so decide to raise it with their superiors. They're sacked from their positions immediately, with allegations of transphobia being thrown at them, even though Sid is not trans. Now, obviously in the real world this is very unlikely to happen, as the strict safeguarding measures they have in place are... wait, what? Oh, it turns out that this is exactly what has happened at the Girl Guides. The Girl Guide leaders Helen Watts and Katie Alcock were both expelled from the organisation after raising objections over the lack of safeguarding inherent in the Guide's new policy on including trans-identifying males as Guide members, including males who want to be troop leaders. These males can all share tents, toilets, changing spaces and more with Girl Guides, completely disregarding informed parental consent.
I was a Girl Guide leader. I was running a rainbow unit in West London, aged between 5 and 7. So Girl Guiding is quite famous for doing lots of camping and residential trips. I mean, even with rainbows, the very little ones, I would take them for sleepovers just for one night. So there would be sort of shared sleeping accommodation. So the policy was written in a very positive, upbeat sort of way, like we're so diverse and inclusive, so we're going to admit members on the basis of their gender identity. But you only have to think about that for a minute before you start to realise actually that could be quite problematic, and it does start to raise some issues. So we're not set up to accommodate sort of both sexes, especially in terms of things like camping facilities and residential facilities. I raised quite a few separate points with them. So there was the obvious ones around safeguarding. So Girl Guiding is set up as a single-sex organisation. If you change the admission requirements to gender identity, then you are de facto mixed-sex operation. I felt that we would need to safeguard and have policies in place that reflect that mixed-sex situation.
The most shocking aspect for this to me is the fact that Girl Guide leaders, an adult male, can identify as a woman and become a Girl Guide leader. Is that correct?
That is correct, yeah. The criteria for becoming a volunteer and taking the promise is that you identify as a woman. But the rules are very clear that any males must have completely separate sleeping and washing accommodation. They must have their own sort of shower block, and they must sleep separately to the rest of the girls. It's very, very strict. However, if there is a male child or a male adult who identifies as a woman, then he or she is then entitled to use the women and girls facilities. The male who identifies as a woman who's an adult leader is still entitled to use the same shower blocks, the same loos, the same communal sleeping accommodation as the women.
Yeah, because it was
like
never,
me, yeah.
It was never a question. It was never a question that it wouldn't be a woman doing it until
Exactly.
three years ago. And the thing that blows me away about this is basically what you're saying is that Girl Guide's safeguarding principles are very robust.
Very.
Until someone says, well, I'm a woman. If a male who is identifying as a woman is a Girl Guide leader, the parents do not have to be informed. In fact, do they specify that the parents shouldn't be informed of someone's trans status?
Yes, that's correct.
That's extraordinary. Predators are the ones who will, you know, they are looking for any gap in safeguarding they can find. And this isn't a gap. You could drive a truck through this gap.
No one wants to think that somebody might do that, but we do have to think somebody might do that so that we can set up systems in place to minimize it. Part of the expulsion means that I am banned from all girl guiding meetings and events. I'm not allowed to contact anyone.
Unfortunately for sex pest Sid, the camping trip is suddenly cancelled due to stormy weather, meaning that he can't get close to the young girls at all and has to drive home alone. Sid isn't deterred though and thinks of a great idea. He signs up for the nearest breastfeeding support group, despite not having breasts or being female in any way. He just thinks this might be a good way to see women's boobs in real life, rather than on his grubby computer screen. He joins the group and they start to discuss the various issues around breastfeeding, rather than getting their breasts out at all. Sid grows bored by this conversation but still helps himself to the free tea and biscuits before making up a salacious story all about how much he likes to breastfeed his children, even though he doesn't have any children, doesn't have any breasts, isn't a woman, and isn't trans. The rest of the group, although disrupted by Sid's antics, politely listen and nod along to his story, as they don't want to risk being labelled non-inclusive or gatekeeping, or even worse, being branded a transphobic bigot and being kicked out of the group. Sid ends up talking for the majority of the meeting, meaning that many of the women aren't able to speak about their own situations. In the real world, this is happening in many breastfeeding groups. La Lesh League, who run 80 breastfeeding support groups across the UK, changed their policy last year, now allowing trans-identified males to join their local meetings. The organisation have also stopped using the term breastfeeding, instead now referring to it as chest feeding. And it's not just La Lesh League who are policing language. The Australian Breastfeeding Association have recently suspended 7 of their counsellors for using the term mother.
Hey Mama, do you have a minute to talk? Yeah. You know, early on, we had a little hiccup with not wanting to assign a gender or sex to the baby. She's just still asking if it's a boy or a girl, and it's really frustrating.
The baby has been able to latch, but I've not been able to produce any milk.
There's something wrong behind the baby's eyes.
Would you have done it?
Would have done what?
Breastfeed using this to the baby?
No, I wouldn't. Like you said, I'll get a
Now you've
bottle.
got it on and...
No, I don't know.
If it's got to
You wouldn't know how much, you know. You could go a bit mad and drown it or something. You know, so...
Yeah?
No, I wouldn't.
I think
but
we're gonna...
it does feel very...
Weird.
No, it's quite nice, actually. But,
Still... Do you know...
Sid, being a sex pest, decided that once was enough for that particular group, and not being able to see breasts was a bit of a frustration. He decides to get drunk in a local lesbian bar, where the self-ID policy means that he can't be challenged by anyone. He sees a woman wearing a t-shirt with a feminist slogan on it. He speaks to security and has her thrown out of the bar, just because he feels like it. The woman and her friends argue about it, but the owner of the bar bans them for life for being transphobic, even though Sid is not trans. In the real world, this has happened on several occasions, including a few weeks ago in August 2021, when the women's rights campaigner Marion Miller and her friends were thrown out of the Green King franchise Doctors pub in Edinburgh, and subjected to a volley of misogynistic abuse from the bar manager, who regularly posts hardcore pornography on his own Twitter timeline.
Are we really ready, as a society, to hand our civilization over to perverts? Are we really willing to allow women to be run out of public life so that men who publicly proclaim themselves to be porn addicts can feel comfortable in public space? Because that's what we're on our way to doing. Marion Miller, who already has to go to court, who is already being persecuted by the Scottish government. She went to Doctor's Bar with some other activists, and she was thrown out because the manager, who was a man who impersonates women, felt threatened or uncomfortable because she was there. Now, what was she doing? She was coming back from the restroom. So she was by herself, and she was set upon by this manager who called her a TERF, told her to drink her fucking drink and get out. What did Marion Miller do to call the wrath of bartender down on her? Well, acknowledge biological fact. That's all you need to do at this point. And she also had the temerity to advocate for women's rights on Twitter. Oh no! Oh no!
We stand with Marion Miller! 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 We stand with Marion Miller!
The evening ends badly for Sid, as not only does everyone avoid him in the bar, he's also thrown out and beaten up by security for trying to grab at some of the women. Sid ends up in hospital, but being the sneaky sex pest that he is, he claims that he identifies as a woman, despite not actually believing that he is. As such, the hospital staff have no choice but to place him on a female-only ward. If they didn't do so, they may have been faced with discrimination claims against them, losing their jobs for not believing that Sid was an actual woman. Sid is able to spend the night in the female-only ward. He eyes up several nurses and patients, but sadly for him, he doesn't get to see any of the women naked, as their curtains are drawn over anytime he wants to have a good look. So he simply sets up a small spy camera in the women's bathroom and settles down in bed to watch porn on his mobile phone. In the real world, mixed-sex wards in hospital have actually been banned, with trusts and clinical commissioning groups being fined for each breach. There are some specific exemptions for specialist wards, but overall, hospital wards are supposed to be, by law, single-sex. And this makes a lot of sense, as a Channel 4 news survey found that 2/3 of all sexual assault by hospital patients took place on mixed-sex wards. But increasingly, mixed-sex spaces have moved to become mixed-gender spaces, allowing trans-identifying males into these wards, just by saying that they identify as women. The Telegraph recently reported that guidance had been given to many members of hospital staff that patients should be admitted on the basis of their gender identity rather than their sex, and can therefore simply choose on which ward they want to be. This guidance completely goes against the Department of Health's orders that hospital wards must be separated by sex. The Telegraph reports that this appears to be a particular issue in mental health wards, where patients are often locked together, noting that allegations of sexual assault at one mental health unit have been made. This mixing of sexes also led to the trans-identified male, John Marshall, who uses the name Julie Marshall, being reported as a woman when arrested on a female ward after using the hospital Wi-Fi to download images of child exploitation and sexual assault. At this stage, we'd like to point out, as we have in our previous videos, that trans-identifying males are not more likely than any other males to carry out sexual assaults and other crimes, but they are also no less likely to do so either. And with males committing more than 75% of all violent crimes and 98% of all crimes of a sexual nature, this matters a great deal to the safety, privacy and dignity of women in hospitals.
BBC News has found that in the last year alone, men and women were treated in the same room around 9,000 times. That's almost 3 times the figure from 2 years ago.
In 2013, the Health Secretary told his party conference that mixed-sex wards had virtually gone. The first time the breaches were measured was in December 2010. That month alone, there were 11,802 cases. The new government policy saw the number drop markedly. At its lowest point, it was 2,431, not per month, but for the whole year in 2014. Since then, though, they've risen. The latest annual figure was 9,003. Figures for mental health trusts are far lower as there are fewer hospitals, but the health watchdog, the Care Quality Commission, found some hospitals in the sector are not following the rules. This woman has bipolar disorder and was placed in mixed accommodation when she was admitted. She's asked to remain anonymous.
I've had incidents where males have tried to pursue me, pushing notes under my door. With shared bathrooms, shared lounge facilities and dining facilities, there's no way you can be private as a female.
And whereabouts.
We know that if patients are nursed by the right people at the right time in the right place, that actually their length of stay does decrease, and their risks to staying in hospital are minimised and reduced.
If there's just one person who's in a mixed-sex setting where their privacy or their dignity is compromised, or where they feel unsafe, or where indeed they are unsafe, that's one person too many.
When people come into hospital, they need privacy, and men in men's ward and women in women's ward is the correct procedure.
It's nice to have your own designated area, female area for toilets and bathrooms.
Well, with physical illness itself, people often don't want to be seen by the other sex looking at their worst, but with mental illness it goes really much further. I mean, they may have lost a lot of self-respect, they may feel very afraid, and often they describe that being on a mixed-sex wards, they feel quite intimidated. In fact, so much so that they don't want to remain as voluntary patients.
When Sid returns home, he feels even more frustrated with his thwarted efforts than before. He hears that a local domestic abuse shelter has changed their inclusion policy. They are now forced to allow trans-identified males into the shelter or lose their funding, closing them down for good. Sex Pest Sid thinks that this would be an ideal opportunity to see vulnerable women and hear all about their abuse. He goes along, posing as a woman, gains entry, and is pretty much left alone with several abused women. Most of the women in the shelter are wary of Sid, but they're told to stop being transphobic and bigoted. Some of them complain to the senior management, but are told to re-educate themselves and to reframe their trauma to deal with transgender people, even though Sid is not trans. In the real world, this is already happening. Remember earlier we spoke about Katie Dolotowski, the trans-identified male who sexually assaulted a 10-year-old girl in Morrison's women's toilets? Well, he was placed into a female hostel, much to the consternation and concern of the women already housed there. There have been many other incidents in which males, trans-identifying or not, have been placed into women's shelters, including Mark Addis, who uses the name Melissa Addis. Addis had previously served prison time for repeatedly threatening to kill his ex-partner, the mother of his child. Addis served 6 months and began identifying as a woman once released, despite not having any surgery, either medical or hormonal. Addis was helped in his bid to gain access to a female-only hostel by Stonewall's Housing Association, before he began frequenting a women's refuge shelter set up by East London Women's Project and St Mungo's homelessness charity. Both groups were aware of Addis's conviction for abusing his female partner, but still allowed him into the shelter. Refuge shelters are home to some of the most vulnerable women in society, often escaping from abusive partners themselves. This change in policy to allow abusive males such as Addis to enter them seems completely at odds with their main function. The safety, privacy and dignity of these women seems to have been totally fucking ignored. And as for people raising these safeguarding concerns, such as the Labour campaigner Joan Smith, well, they face being fired from their jobs. Smith worked at City Hall but was recently sacked by the Labour Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, after she claimed that female victims of male violence shouldn't be placed in refuges with male-bodied people. This seems a reasonable and rational thing to believe, but Khan and his team instead decided to kick Smith out of her job. As if that wasn't bad enough, it was recently revealed that the CEO of Edinburgh Rape Crisis, the trans-identified male Mridul Wadhwa, recently claimed that survivors of sexual violence may be bigots with unacceptable beliefs, who need to rethink their relationship with prejudice if they feel uncomfortable with males sharing their safe spaces. Wadhwa told rape victims who do not want to share these spaces with males that they should reframe their trauma. Questions are now being asked about Wadhwa, who applied to the position without informing the Rape Crisis Centre that he was a trans-identified male. Wadhwa claims that he came over to the UK from India as a woman in 2004, which doesn't really make a lot of sense given that India only implemented gender transitioning laws in 2019, and Wadhwa does not hold a gender recognition certificate of any kind. meaning that Wadvar could not legally have been classed as a woman at all during that time, and isn't legally classed as one now. So how did a male-bodied person end up as the CEO of one of the largest rape crisis shelters in the UK, especially as the application form for the role explicitly stated that the role is for female-only candidates, and asks about the applicant's transgender status? The answer is that Wadvar has lied, and has admitted to such deception in order to get the post. Instead of sacking Wadvar though, as any right-minded organisation would have done, Edinburgh Rape Crisis decided to keep him on. So, despite not having had gender reassignment surgery, not having any form of a GRC, and literally admitting to having deceived them, Wadvar remains in the role designated for a woman. Why has safeguarding been so ignored in this instance?
Scotland, the country that's given us Mriddle Wada, the man who lied his way into a job at Forth Valley Rape Crisis, then failed up to become the CEO of Edinburgh Rape Crisis. And how did he do that? By lying and saying that he's a woman.
And I don't have a gender recognition certificate. I probably won't get one because I come from India. I can't really change my birth certificate. There is no process for doing that.
Really? So even if this was changed, would that ever be possible? So I didn't know that.
I don't think so. But I do have my documentation, my passport and so on that says female, and I was able to change that with the Indian government. But they don't have a process of changing your birth certificate. And I think so for people like me who probably will need a gender recognition certificate in the future, many years after we've transitioned for whatever practical purposes, like whether it's for pension rights or anything like that, I think the self-ID process should make it easy.
Pretty clear to me that I was the only trans woman in the women's aid movement, and I wasn't even sure whether I would have been hired if they had known that I was trans.
There are many people who are concerned that if trans women can self-identify and come into a refuge, that may trigger all sorts of things in cis women. Have you come up against this?
Yes, I have, around this issue. Sexual violence happens to bigoted people as well. And, it is not a discerning crime. But these spaces are also for you. But if you bring unacceptable beliefs that are discriminatory in nature, we will begin to work with you on your journey of recovery from trauma. But please also expect to be challenged on your prejudices. But if you have to reframe your trauma, I think you also have to reframe your relationship with prejudice.
I think it's a moment to check your privilege. And I think it's a struggle for some people to acknowledge that someone's had to face something perhaps even more challenging than you have.
Being called a man was never one of them, and it does not bother me. So you can fuck right off.
It's really interesting. Heck yeah.
Back to Sid in the women's shelter. Sid is happy and thinks he's going to spend several nights alone with these vulnerable women. Sadly for Sid, however, he gets caught placing a small spy camera in the bathroom and is finally arrested by the police. The police, however, have to record Sid as being female, even though he isn't, and doesn't consider himself a woman at all, because he's not trans. The police have no option though, as to record his sex as male would mean going against their own internal inclusion policies, leaving them open to accusations of being bigoted or transphobic, or leaving the officers themselves liable to having a non-crime hate incident against their records. Sid loves the attention though, especially when being strip searched. He deliberately asks for female officers to carry this out, and it's the first time any woman has seen his tiny willy in years. Sid is eventually sent to court, where he again states that he is a woman. He doesn't believe this, as we keep repetitively reiterating, as he isn't trans at all. He knows he's a man, and he's happy to be a man. He's just playing the system. In court, the women who are at the shelter all have to address him by female pronouns. This gives Sid a feeling of control over them, which he enjoys, because he's a sex pest. One of the women complains about this and refuses to use female pronouns. She is quickly charged with contempt of court, called a bigot and a transphobe by the media reporting on the trial, and has to leave the courtroom in disgrace. The judge sentences Sid to 2 years in prison for voyeurism, the maximum sentence he can be given. Sid is very sad at this, because it means he can't return to his sex pest ways. Or does it? Sid is now registered in the system as being a woman. Due to the change in policy in many prisons, this means that Sid can now request a transfer to a women's prison, where he will be housed in a cell with a woman. Sadly, in the real world, this seems to be happening more and more. In America, Canada, Ireland and the UK, it's pretty much a given that a trans-identifying male will be placed into a women's prison. And as a result, there have been serious sexual assaults against women in those prisons by those trans-identifying males. This also includes the case of David Thompson, who also uses the name Karen White. Thompson is a trans-identifying male who has not undergone any medical surgery. He was convicted in 2018 of multiple counts of serious sexual assault, including sexual assault on a pregnant woman. He was also convicted of the stabbing of an elderly male and a count of burglary. Thompson already had an extensive history of violence and sexual offences against women and children, with several previous convictions of indecent assault and gross indecency with a child. Thompson had also admitted to having sexual interest in children during his interviews with his probation officers. But despite this lengthy record of violence against women and children, Thompson was placed into HMP New Hall, a women's prison. While there, Thompson committed 4 counts of sexual assault against female prisoners who were forced to share a cell with him. Newspaper reports still refer to Thompson as being a woman, using female pronouns when describing his assaults. The apparent lack of any safeguarding towards the female prisoners at New Hall has led to this. Thompson was obviously a risk to women at the prison, yet this was apparently overlooked by the prison authorities in order to appear inclusive. It may be the case that males such as Thompson aren't actually transgender, or have any intention to live as a woman. But with the current safeguarding rules being so relaxed, this doesn't really matter. A recent report by the prison's watchdog showed that 1 in 50 men in prison are now identifying as being transgender. This is more than 4 times the number in the general population. This raises the question we've asked in previous videos. Are trans-identified males more likely to be criminally minded, or are the laws surrounding self-ID simply being abused by bad actors? No trans activist will ever address this paradoxical question though, as either answer suggests that males should not be placed in women's prisons.
Our top story tonight, questions over why a rapist transitioning to become a woman was remanded to a female jail.
Karen White was given life today after she was found guilty of sexually assaulting 2 female inmates at New Hall Prison and previously raping 2 other women.
Wearing a wig, glasses and a floral blouse. She was described in court as a predator who was a danger to women and to children. The court heard how she used her transgender persona to put herself in contact with vulnerable women. She'd ended up in the female New Hall prison at Wakefield on remand after a number of sexual offences, including rape. She'd also stabbed an elderly male neighbour. It was while she was in New Hall she sexually assaulted 2 inmates who'd she'd befriended. White had previous convictions for indecent assault, indecent exposure and gross indecency involving children, and violence and dishonesty too. Judge Christopher Batty told Karen White she was predatory, highly manipulative and a significant risk to children. Tonight, though, questions about how someone who'd raped women and who claimed to be transgender ended up in a female jail before undergoing any proper gender reassignment and was able to abuse fellow inmates.
Well, the first thing to say is precisely that. Karen White is a male who was convicted of a number of serious sexual assaults against women, and in that context, I'm not sure how helpful it is to describe Karen White as a she. Now, how he ended up in a women's prison was because he put in an application claiming that he identified as a woman, and in some circumstances, male prisoners can get a transfer to women's prison in those circumstances.
A transgender rapist who was moved to a women-only jail, despite still having male genitalia, was segregated after making unwanted sexual advances on female inmates, We have a male transgender prisoner guilty of a brutal murder moved from a women's jail because he kept having intercourse with female inmates. There are, it seems, examples of where people are being moved and then pose a threat. This is the point, isn't it? Pose a threat to the women in prison.
Yep. Already it's possible to do that, but it will only ever get worse.
But we should remember that transgender women are women, they're not men. However, I have immense sympathy when it comes down to sex offenders.
This week, you've been very unequivocal about your support for a policy which has come to be known as sex self-ID. The idea that whether someone is a man or a woman is basically down to a matter of them saying what they are and going through an administrative process. So I wanted to ask you, given the growing number of sex offenders, such as someone like Christopher Wharton, who is a male sex offender he's a child rapist who was convicted last year of breach of court order, who's already convicted of being multiple child rape, who is now claiming to be a woman. Given that we know there's a growing number of these men, should he be accommodated in a women's or a men's prison?
You asked about whether trans people should be in women's or men's prisons. Well, I think trans women are women, and I think trans men are men. So I think that they should be accommodated in the prisons of their choosing.
So, you're transgender and you're in prison. What now? Well, for starters, corrections institutions must take into consideration a person's gender identity, meaning that corrections agencies are prohibited from placing transgender inmates into men's or women's units solely based on their anatomy at birth. So then, what's it based on? Where do you put the people who say they're neither male nor female? The major concern is changing our prison system to accommodate transgender inmates will put other inmates, particularly women, at risk, especially when you consider the fact that anyone can identify as a woman and then change to a female facility.
We need to protect people like Tara, but I don't think that's through moving people like Tara into a female prison, because women shouldn't have to pick up the risk there and take that.
Thanks. I'm going to pause it there, Tara. I'm going to pause it there, Tara. Thank you. Tara Hudson, thank you for talking to us, and Melissa Briscoe, and also Dr. Nicola Williams. Thank you.
Unfortunately for Sid, he had to share a cell with a trans-identifying male, so the women of the prison remained out of his grubby little reach. Also, the next day he died of, I don't know, dysentery or something, who cares, and he was never heard from again, so, you know, we made him up, so we can just kill him off. Now, all of this has been a little bit of a silly way to highlight the serious issues at hand here. Each of the scenarios we painted have occurred in the real world, when gender identity inclusion is judged to be more important than safeguarding and the protection of women and girls, and people become scared to speak out or even punished for doing so, something somewhere has gone very badly wrong. If the laws around self-ID are implemented, characters like Sid and the multitude of his real-world counterparts will be allowed to gain access to female-only spaces. There are no satisfying, clear or good arguments that could ever be given in support of removing these safeguards, and certainly none that have ever been put forward by proponents of the gender identity ideology. Obviously, everyone deserves to be treated with respect and dignity. This includes women, which a lot of people and organisations seem to be forgetting. We have to say that if your ideology doesn't notice the unintended consequences and the harm it's doing to women, then that's one thing. But if you do understand the damage it will cause and still push for the reduction of safeguarding rules, then that's nothing short of criminal. And we know that most of the people at the heart of pushing for this reduction are fully aware of the arguments, the consequences and the real world impacts they bring, but they ignore them, dismiss them, or call other people bigots for even questioning them. Something desperately needs to change here, and the people at the top of these businesses, groups and institutions all need to realise that the safety and safeguarding of vulnerable women and children should be the highest priority, even if it hurts the feelings of people like Sid. Well, that's it for now. Thank you so much for joining us. If you liked what you saw, please click on the like button.
You like me!
Ring the bell thing. And please subscribe. That way YouTube thinks it's a good video and drops it into more people's timelines. You can sign up to become a Patreon member and get some cool stuff, and you can find us on Twitter. We did have a coffee page, but it was targeted by gender ideology activists and has been under review for the past year, so don't bother with that. In the unlikely event that you do want to sling us a few quid for making these videos, you can donate via PayPal. It keeps us in tea and biscuits while we edit these things together. Thanks again, and we'll see you all next time.
If I can say erect penis on this programme,